Good morning, it's January 11th, and this is to my liberal friends. Drug prices are too high. We hear that all the time, and everyone believes it and wants the price to be reduced. We hear liberal members of Congress demand that pharmaceutical companies lower their prices. They do this because it appeals to the public, and they don't look past the possible repercussions. And now Republicans are joining that chorus. One of the suggestions for years is to allow the importation of drugs from other countries, specifically Canada. U.S. patients for years have been crossing the border to fill prescriptions at the lower prices offered by Canadian pharmacies. The pressure's been building. As I said, now Republicans seem to be caving, and many are now supporting proposals to allow drugs to be imported from Canada. Florida, led by Governor Ron DeSantis, has approved a plan to import drugs from Canada. They got approved from the FDA, and he's getting support for this effort from the unlikely position of Donald Trump. But what they're doing is importing the price controls from a country like Canada with socialized healthcare systems and, in effect, outsourcing the regulation of drugs to foreign countries. The approval of the FDA here in the United States has long been the gold seal of approval for any new drug. And there's a reason for this. And this is why the vast majority of new drugs are developed here in the United States and seek to gain market approval in the U.S. The United States enforces strong patent protection for any new product, specifically new drugs. This protection comes under the Hatch-Waxman amendments to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Prior to these amendments, many new drugs would see their patent protection expire before they even got to market. It was these amendments that basically created the generic drug market as we know it. Being upfront with transparency, I've represented multiple pharmaceutical companies during my professional career, both on the brand name side and the generic side. I represented a generic company, Mylan, during the changes to patent law in '95. At that time, the U.S. used to grant patents for 17 years from date of approval. It was changed to conform to the rest of the world and be 20 years from date of application. Drug patents are one of the few patents that have real value throughout the life of the patent. Now let's talk about the problem with this idea of importing drugs from Canada. First, you have to understand why they're cheaper in Canada. It's because the Canadian government places price controls on drugs. They tell the drug companies how much they can charge. And this works for brand name drugs, but when it comes to generic drugs, they're less expensive here in the United States. Second, these are not drugs created in Canada. They're developed and manufactured here in the United States. Canada imports them, but places, as I said, price controls on them. When you import drugs from Canada, you're basically re-importing them back to the United States. When you hear politicians bragging about how much you can save by getting drugs from Canada, remember there are some things they're not telling you. They only talk about the cost and not the potential problems. Federal law generally prohibits the importation of prescription drugs sold in foreign countries that haven't been approved by the FDA. This closed system protects Americans from adulterated, counterfeit, and mislabeled drugs. The FDA inspects plants that produce medicine for the U.S. market, not so plants that make drugs for foreign countries. The risk of counterfeit or contaminated drugs isn't trivial. The FDA recently said it is investigating counterfeit versions of the diabetes drug Ozempic that turned up in the legitimate U.S. drug supply and have seized thousands of units of the product. And they added sterility of the needles cannot be confirmed, which presents an increased risk of infection. They're also not mentioning that American consumers get access to more innovative drugs and sooner. Drugs were approved 468 days earlier in the U.S. than Canada for the 218 medicines authorized in both countries between 2013 and 2019, the latest study. What will happen is that pharmaceutical companies will limit how many of their products they will sell to Canada if they simply turn around and send them back to the U.S. Canada's realized this potential problem, and they've stated that they would restrict drug exports to the U.S. to ensure there's a sufficient supply for patients in Canada. The FDA will also be forced to step in and ensure any drug imported to the U.S. are safe. They will all have to be tested and make sure they comply with FDA standards and labeling requirements. And that's going to put additional cost on the so-called cheaper drugs. Finally, the real problem is one that politicians ignore. If you cut the cost of these drugs, it will lower the ability of pharmaceutical companies to invest in research for new therapies. It will mean fewer innovative drugs will come to the market. The cost of developing a drug is huge, and they go through years of development and trials to ensure they do what they are expected. The average cost to bring a new drug to market now costs just over $2 billion. That figure includes the average cost of developing a candidate from discovery through clinical trials to the market. Most of them are discarded somewhere along the way because they fail in one of the early trials. Well, there's a simple solution out there, and as I mentioned, a patent starts at the date of application and runs for 20 years. For most patents, it takes about 18 months to gain approval from the patent office, and then you're on the market. But how many of you would buy a 20-year-old electronic patent, or even a 10-year-old one? But drugs are different. They're also treated differently in the patent process. Once they are granted a patent, they begin the FDA approval process, which can take years. Under the Hatch-Waxman amendments, they're assured of at least 5 years of patent protection, but no more than 13 years. Why not stop the clock while they're undergoing FDA trial, then restart the clock when they are FDA approved for the market? That would allow drug manufacturers to reduce costs because they would have longer patent protection and more years to recoup their R&D costs. Generics would be okay because it would give them a date certain the product is coming off patent. That's all they want. Put language in the law that if drug costs do not go down with a longer patent life, then there will be penalties up to and including the loss of patent protection. This would be one possible solution to a problem that continues to fester, and politicians try to make something out of it without any real understanding of the issues surrounding drug pricing. It's been To My Liberal Friends. Thanks for listening.